Hi class, it's Susan again. So in this week, I just want to touch on some of the questions that might help you go a little bit deeper into the readings, but also do a very, very brief history of modern metaphysics. So in this week, most of the articles and reading assignments that you're asked to cover are about what does it mean to have a mind? What does it mean to have a mind? What's the relationship between mind and body? So these are some questions that came up for me with some of the readings. So for you to be able to identify what is the dogma of the ghost in the machine, so really look at what is that. Also, here's a question. Does a materialistic view allow us to really look at consciousness? So think about what your answer is to that. Is it yes or no? And then the Nagel article on imagining yourself as imagining the interior life of another species, like a bat, I think is so interesting because it helps us frame the question from a different animal's perspective. So the Turing test, created by Alan Turing, the imitation game, is based on his life. Very interesting movie. I recommend it highly. And essentially, he's saying that a computer simulation could ultimately, he's trying to see whether a computer simulation could mimic the behavior of two people talking about something. So that's the Turing test, because ultimately the question is about what does whether or not computers are sentient or demonstrate consciousness in some way, shape, or form. Now, in the article, Do Computers Think?, I want you to really focus in on what John Searle says about strong versus weak AI. So strong AI really is this idea that if a computer can compute, they are mimicking thinking. Whereas weak AI is a limited definition about whether or not a computer has consciousness. So that's a really important argument if you're going to come down on the side of whether or not computers think. You have to identify, first of all, whether you agree with strong versus weak AI. Okay, so this is something that if we were in a class together, I would ask you to create an argument from either or both. So I think one of the things that since we don't see each other face to face, we're not doing as much practice of this. It's just taking any visual image or construct and making an argument about it. So remember, Thomas Nagel is the one who wrote the article about what it would be like could you imagine being like a bat? I know I'm not quoting the title exactly. So consciousness is what makes the mind-body problem really intractable. So of course, the first thing you have to do is understand what intractable means. So how could you create an argument about that statement? What claim would you be making, and what evidence would you use to support your claim? So remember, every time you're doing something, you're constructing an argument where you have to have a conclusion and at least one premise. Now, the second image was a picture I took in Scotland a couple of summers ago, and my husband and I were visiting this B&B, and the proprietor, who was just this lovely man, it asked us whether or not we wanted to visit the ferries. Now, I'm not kidding you. And I thought, yeah, I want to visit the ferries. So this is actually a spot called the Cloutiwell. And at the Cloutiwell, which is a spring, a hidden spring in the forest, where people would go to put their tie a piece of fabric around something near the spring, so that the fairies, kind of prayer, if you will, so the fairies could come. Yes, I did say fairies, and I mean fairies, could come and take your, or somehow listen to your prayer. So someone left this there, which really struck me. So I took a picture of it. Live your life. And this was at the Cloutiwell, up near Inverness on the Black Island in Scotland. Okay, here's a lot of information laid out for you, but I think these are helpful terms, and the article about the mind-body problem studies looks at them as well, so they're written about there. Also, I consulted Louis Vaughn, who's a very good philosophy teacher and textbook author, and I thought he had a really good way of defining these terms. So historically, we have to realize that there's kind of basically two different camps that seem to occur around this question of what is the nature of our mind, and what does it mean to have a body and perceive that the mind is separate. So these are all the questions related to mental phenomena versus physical phenomena. So substance dualism is the idea that your mind, okay, so remember, people are talking about this at a time when there isn't a whole study of the brain or neuroscience or any of that. And holds that the mind and body are two fundamentally different substances. They're both material, one is material, and one is immaterial. So, Rene Descartes, very famous French philosopher and mathematician who you're reading about this week, took that idea of dualism a little bit farther. Now, whereas substance dualism says there's no interaction, or assumes that there's probably no interaction, they're just different substances, Rene Descartes proposed this idea that they were actually related. There's some interaction between the immaterial and the material. And so this is referred to as the Cartesian dualism. And in the Cartesian dualism, it actually supports the idea of an immortal soul. So, a more recent development, which is property dualism, suggests that there are mental properties. Mental properties are non-material aspects arising from physical properties. So anytime you have an experience, like let's say you have an experience in the real world where your arm is hurt, okay, and there are thoughts that arise about having the arm hurt. Now, notice I'm not referring to emotions, which may be said to have some sort of, we could say in the modern era that feelings have a biological basis. But let's just talk about the reality that all of you know you have, that anytime something happens to you, not only is there a physical reaction, there are thoughts about it. So, property dualism says that there is an essential dualism, but it's not quite so clear as substance dualism, so that you have these thoughts arising from a physical reality. Okay. Now, this is a really important concept to recognize. You don't necessarily have to agree with it, but you have to notice that at some point in history, people realize the reason why there's all this mind-body problem is because of religion. It's because the concepts of the soul and what happens to the body after death, which shifts, honestly, in Judeo-Christian tradition, because in the beginning, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, there was actually no separation of body and soul. The Jews conceived of it as being a unity of sorts. So later on, though, Christians seem to adopt this Platonic idea that the soul is actually separate from the body. So as we progress through history, sooner or later, somebody comes up with, no, I don't think there is such a thing as a soul, or there's nothing that happens after you die, or there's some way of explaining everything through physical material reality. So materialism is the claim that every object in the world is material. Now, logical behaviorism, you might notice behaviorism is a field in psychology, but there's some implications in the field of behaviorism, which says that any idea or mental states or feelings or dispositions that you or I may have are basically consequences. They're linked to the behavior or actions that we experience. So let me give you, so the behaviorists would say that all of our mental states or feelings are basically behavior patterns that have been conditioned in a certain way. Now, here are two ideas that are very, very similar to each other. I'm not sure I could even distinguish them. But the first idea, which is a materialistic idea, is that mental states are identical to physical brain states. So the frontal cortex is often, which is the front part of the brain, is often associated with thinking and higher order reasoning, whereas the limbic part of the brain, which is around the brainstem, is related to emotion regulation, fight or flight, etc. So mental states are identical to physical brain states is identity theory. A close second is that the mind, functionalism is the mind is the functions that the brain performs. So now, one thing that's really interesting about this is that even the concept of mind in the Western world ends up having a different connotation. So mind, what part of the body do you associate with the mind? You're probably going to be pointing to your head. Did you know that in many Asian countries, and certainly Asian countries that are influenced by the study of Buddhism, they think of, when someone asks them, a Buddhist, where their mind is, they point to their heart. Oh, okay, so what does that do for you? Does that change your views a little bit? David Chalmers is a modern philosopher, and I think this is a really helpful argument, right? Now notice the first three statements are premises, and the last statement is his conclusion. So he is, first of all, he is saying it is conceivable that there may be zombies. Now, I want you to not associate David Chalmers' zombies with the zombies of movies or somehow horror genre fiction. In his mind, zombies are people. Can you imagine? Is it conceivable to you? Can you imagine that there could be people who exist that have no thoughts? They don't have consciousness. They're not thinking about anything. I mean, this question of what is consciousness is fascinating, right? The second statement he makes is that the premise is that if it is conceivable that there may be zombies, aka people with no consciousness, it is metaphysically possible there may be zombies. 3, if it is metaphysically possible that there may be zombies, then consciousness is non-physical. I don't know if you guys are you agreeing with each statement? That's the question. So his conclusion is consciousness is non-physical. So this is saying if there could be a person without consciousness, then consciousness is not material. Consciousness is non-physical. That's the idea. So this whole question of what is consciousness and what is thinking is a very fascinating question. Okay, Rene Descartes, who was a 16th, born in the 16th century, but we're really reading about him in the 17th century, in the 1600s, was a very influential French mathematician and philosopher. And he had some interesting ideas that came about as he was sleeping in the life of leisure. Well, I don't know about that, but. So Rene Descartes says one thing he noticed is he can't really tell if he is actually, while he's awake, is he really awake or is he dreaming? So he's speculating. This is one of the thought experiments that are done. But he doesn't, he realizes that he doesn't really know all the time. Do you really know if you're awake or asleep? He's sure he can't doubt that a square has 4 sides. But then he has another conjecture, which is referred to as the evil demon conjecture, whereby he posits that there may be a demon trickster deceiving him at every turn. So maybe he can't even say that a square has 4 sides, because he may be being deceived by some evil demon. But one thing he says is that he can be sure of is that cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. So this statement, which he is most well known for, is saying whatever else I may be experiencing, I'm not really sure of. Because again, he's a little bit more in the line of Plato. Plato being someone who essentially mistrusts the senses because senses deceive. And yes, they do. So one of the claims that Rene Descartes, first of all, he was a Christian and a believer, And he did try and reconcile, even though he did not come up with a fancy proof for the existence of God, but he does posit that there are two substances, material substance or extension, governed by material laws, and that there's also mind or thought. Now so here's where he said there could be interaction, because he posited that the immaterial mind can actually move one's body. And interestingly enough, he had a pretty complex idea that this crossover control was located in the pineal gland, which is interesting because it's in the center of the brain. But that's not true. The pineal gland has nothing to do with that. So here we have this idea where he assumes the existence of God, and he is really reflecting on consciousness and this idea that he thinks about things as a way to understand reality. And obviously, reality has two elements to it. Thomas Hobbes was a contemporary English philosopher who based his observations on science. And he was really probably one of the first true materialists. And he said that all that exists is bodies in motion. So he could describe everything as bodies in motion. So his metaphysics was materialistic and singular, and unified, not dualistic. Now, Thomas Hobbes, and most people read about Thomas Hobbes in political philosophy. Political philosophy being, it's one of the things you might recognize is Thomas Hobbes is attributed as saying life is nasty, brutish, and short. So he had a sort of negative worldview of how people live together. But he said there are basically two types of bodies. There are physical bodies, which are tracked by natural philosophy, and then there are political bodies, which is described and talked about with civil philosophy. And you'll see we'll read some things about Thomas Hobbes when we get to our brief module on political philosophy. So notice he's saying that thought and emotion are also bodies in motion. The other observation that Thomas Hobbes had is that when we look towards something, when we desire something, we move toward it. So the concept of emotional like or desire or attachment is associated with movement towards an object, behavior, whatever. This is born to be true by behaviorists, by the way. And then when there's something that we dislike or we hate, we have an aversive reaction to it. We move away from it. Now, I wanted to bring up a different philosopher who is a contemporary, lived a little bit later, so a little bit after Descartes and Hobbes, but he is also a very influential philosopher who came up with a completely unique idea. So, his unique idea was that the body and mind are of the same substance. Body and mind are of the same substance. So, neither materialism, it was neither a strictly materialistic stance, and it certainly wasn't dualism. It was a unified, monistic kind of idea. Now, so remember, Descartes was French and Roman Catholic. Hobbes was British or English and ostensibly was living at a time of Christian, where most people were Christian, but he seemed to be one of the few people who could get away with not saying very much about Christianity or what his beliefs or non-beliefs in God. But Spinoza was a Jewish man who was from Portugal, and his family fled persecution and moved to Holland. So he was raised in Holland. He eventually was excommunicated from his Jewish synagogue after saying that there were inconsistencies in the Hebrew scriptures. So he said Moses didn't write the first 5 books. So for one thing to notice about him is that he's already on the outs with the dominant culture. Probably why I find him interesting, to be honest with you. But he also was not rich. He didn't have all these affluent teaching jobs. He actually was an optometrist. So for Spinoza, this is interesting. God is the basic substance of everything, or nature. So he's basically saying all of nature is unified as a singular substance that is both body and mind. It's neither material. And he was a pantheist. And a pantheist believes that God is in everything. And so the pantheist does not believe in the personal deity or a singular monotheistic deity or even a polytheistic deities, but that somehow there is the force of God in everywhere. Kind of more like literally the Force in the movies of the Star Wars epics. So what went along with that is that he didn't believe in personal immortality. So he wasn't constructing an afterlife for people of any sort, either an afterlife to heaven or reincarnation. And he also said that free will is an illusion. So here's this person in the 17th century coming up with an idea that's very different. Now, most of the philosophers followed Descartes after him. Very few built on Spinoza, but Spinoza had a very different, interesting idea.